Derek and Maria had by then moved in with her mother, who was close by, and while they maintained their property, they had to make a difficult decision. Be held hostage in their own home, living with the fear of what might happen next, or simply move on, leaving their dream home behind, taking a severe financial loss, but keeping their children safe. Ideas like hiring guards and attack dogs were considered. They had already sold their previous home and essentially beyond Maria's mother's house had nowhere else to go. They would tell those who asked why they hadn't moved in that they had legal issues, leaving others to wonder if their not moving in signaled a coming divorce. They both battled depression and stress issues that would result in the occasional emotional breakdown, particularly Maria, who wanted only to move back to the place of her childhood and raise her own kids there. Eventually, the difficult decision to sell was reached, and 657 Boulevard went back on the market. The sale would be a challenge, with some interested parties offering substantially less than the Broadduses paid for it, and others, becoming aware of the stigma attached to it through word of mouth, being hesitant to incur the wrath of the watcher. Despite the protests of their real estate agent, Derek and Maria insisted that potential new buyers be shown the letters, even if it meant walking away from the sale. They felt strongly that they never wanted anyone to go through what they had endured. At their wits' end, Maria and Derek filed suit against John and Andrea Woods in 2015, claiming because of the letter they had received, they had prior knowledge the property was being observed and stalked, and failed to disclose this to them. The charges were ultimately dismissed by Judge Camille M. Kenny, who stated he was not in a position to enforce a burden on any future sellers as to what they were required to disclose to prospective buyers. Okay, on a side note, depending on what state you live in, sellers are not required by law to disclose any information concerning what is commonly referred to as stigmatized properties. Now, these are properties that may have been the scene of a suicide or a murder, or yes, even a haunting, or anything that may have brought negative publicity to the location, resulting in the potential invasion of privacy that might ensue. Got that? Moving on. By this time, the media were having a field day with the story, and the Broadduses turned down literally hundreds of requests for interviews and comments. TV trucks were often seen parked in front of their house, with reporters clamoring for details of their harrowing experiences. The town itself was abuzz over the identity of the watcher and the infamy their presence had brought to their town. Children became frightened at the thought of simply walking down Boulevard, and at a town council meeting, Mayor Andy Skibitsky tried to quell fears by telling the public a year had passed since the last letters arrived, with no further threats, and the police had done a, quote, exhaustive investigation. Many residents weren't satisfied with that and were curious to know why more neighbors weren't being interviewed. In time, Derek and Maria felt compelled to explain to their kids, some as young as 5, why they weren't moving in and what had happened. They found there were no easy answers to questions like, who is it, or why do they hate us? The Broadduses were still left with the issue of what to do with the house. By 2016, it was put back on the market, with considerations of perhaps even renting it if reasonable bids were not forthcoming. An open house was scheduled, with Derek and Maria comparing handwriting from prospective buyers to that of the watcher. Each time a party was shown a copy of the letters, as Derek and Maria had insisted upon, they inevitably would pass on a possible sale. Their real estate lawyer hit on an idea where they could sell the property to a developer who would tear down the house and divide the land into 2 separate lots. Though subdivisions were frowned on in Westfield, this type of thing had been done before. The town planning board held an open meeting with around 100 residents attending. One neighbor had already hired a lawyer to help fight the proposal, as the Broaddus lawyer, James Forst, explained that they would need an exemption as the property exceeded subdivision limits by a mere 3 feet. Residents stood and argued about anything from removal of trees to elimination of curbside appeal, with neighborhood aesthetics being compromised. By 11:30 p.m., after a marathon 4-hour meeting, the board unanimously voted to reject the proposal. A later appeal was rejected, as well as a request for relief for the $10,000 property tax bill the Broadduses had paid without ever living in the house. A distraught Maria Broaddus fired back about the decisions. Quote, "This is my town. I grew up here. I came back. I chose to raise my kids here. You know what we've been through. You had the ability 2.5 years into a nightmare to make it a little better. And you have decided that this house is more important than we are." That's really how it felt. As if that wasn't enough, a property just around the corner from the Broadduses' house applied for an easement similar to theirs on a piece of property that exceeded the 3 feet that they were asking for. And they were granted the easement. So, what the hell is going on here? Some sliver of hope came when a family agreed to rent the home. They claimed they weren't worried about the watcher, but still had a clause put into the rental agreement that would allow them to leave should they at any point receive a threatening letter. 2 weeks into their stay, Derek arrived to do some routine property maintenance and was handed a letter from the renter. It read in part, "Violent winds and bitter cold. To the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. You wonder who the watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors, who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher." Now, this letter was brought to the police, who speculated that whoever sent it was likely within a 300-yard radius of the house, which encompassed about 10 properties. But beyond that, they still maintained there was very little to go on in terms of proof as to who was sending the letters. The Broadduses again rented the home out, and while there were no further letters directed to the occupants, the constant fear of one arriving at any moment lingered, despite their not having to live there with their children. While the investigation remained open, over time the Watcher lost its stranglehold over the community, and the Broadduses resigned themselves to the idea that his or her identity may never come to light. They had both their detractors and supporters, but to most residents, there was a general attitude that this was all going to eventually go away. And then, this happened. On Christmas Eve of 2017, several people who had been exceptionally critical of the Broadduses, one of them wishing on Facebook the couple be tarred and feathered, received hand-delivered letters in the mail. They addressed the false accusations and inflammatory rhetoric directed at the Broaddus family and the unwillingness to assist them with their issues in any way. Examples of domestic terrorism with accompanied mental illnesses that had gone addressed in recent times were cited, and how they related to the Broadus' situation. The letter was signed, Friends of the Broadus Family. In 2018, the writer of the letter came forward to admit their culpability. It turned out to be none other than Derek Broadus. He claimed it was the only letter he had written, and did so out of his gnawing sense of anger, frustration, and depression at what had engulfed his family. Some good news finally came of all this, as on July 1st, 2019, the house was sold at a much lower price than Derek and Maria paid for it to Andrew and Allison Carr. But despite a loss in excess of $400,000, their personal nightmare seemingly was over. Police Chief David Wayman says the case still remains open, and they have acquired some new leads. Okay, so a crazy story, absolutely. But the lingering question is, who was the watcher, and what was their motivation? Now, there are some suspects, and some of them may surprise you. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at them. Days after the first letter arrived, the Broaduses were invited to a cookout across the street that was held to welcome them and another homeowner to the neighborhood. Derek and Maria, following the lead of Detective Lugo, hadn't mentioned anything to anyone about the letters, but found themselves literally scoping out all those attending. While speaking to a neighbor named John Schmidt, Derek learned of a family named Langford who lived in the house between them. Peggy Langford was in her 90s, and several adult children who were in their 60s lived with her. Schmidt admitted they were all a bit odd, but relatively harmless. One son, Michael, whom Schmidt described with his long beard as a sort of Boo Radley character, didn't work for a living and spent his days at home. He was also known to wander onto other properties and sometimes peek into windows as if he had a license to do it. Michael had been diagnosed with schizophrenia as a youngster and sometimes exhibited odd behavior, but mixed with acts of kindness. People who knew him for the longest of times insisted he wasn't capable of writing letters such as the ones sent to the Broaduses. Despite that, Derek immediately thought they had found their man, as the porch could easily be seen from the Langford property. They had lived there since the 60s, and the father, Richard, had passed away 12 years prior, which played into the notion of a father watching the house for decades. When this was brought to the attention of Detective Lugo, they were surprised to learn he had already entertained the idea and had brought Michael in for a chat, where Michael denied any knowledge of the letters, but conceded that certain details of the interview seemed to match up with the content of them. For whatever reason, he was dismissed as a suspect. Regardless of any other profiles, the Langfords remained squarely on the Broaduses' radar. It just made too much sense to them. With the knowledge of the police, they sent a letter to them indicating their intention to tear the house down and rebuild to try to draw them out. But this made-up nuclear option yielded no response from them. Michael was brought in a second time, which did nothing but result in an accusation of harassment by his sister Abby. In a bold move, a lawyer named Lee Levitt was hired, who met directly with the Langfords and showed them the letters the Broaduses had received, along with photos that clearly showed the easel could be seen. With that came an even stronger assertion that Michael was innocent. A DNA analysis performed on one of the envelopes determined that residue found on it belonged to a woman. Detective Baron Chambliss, who was assigned the case and was sympathetic to the Broaduses' plight, decided to focus on Abby Langford, Michael's sister, who was, in fact, a real estate agent and was thought to be perhaps jealous of losing a commission on the house right next door to her. Chambliss conspired with a security guard at her place of business to secure a water bottle she had used for testing. It was then that prosecutors ruled out the Langfords as suspects. Derek and Maria would go up and down the block with a photo of the handwritten envelope they received in the hope someone would recognize the handwriting. And in one case, a neighbor who was CEO of a security firm was asked to conduct a handwriting analysis on the sample, but no matches were found. Former Sha Na Na band member Robert Leonard, who is now a forensic linguist, was also brought in to look at local online forums to determine any similar styles of writing or prose that might match the Watchers. But he too found nothing that stood out. A scheme to bring in an anonymous hacker to crack into neighborhood Wi-Fi accounts was entertained, but quickly abandoned due to the illegal nature of the practice and the level of difficulty. It was also discovered that around the same time the Broadduses received their first letter, another family on Boulevard received one as well that was written in the same manner. In their case, they had lived in their house for years and their children had all grown into adulthood, so they disregarded it and, like the Woods did, threw it away. This came to light only after news of the Watcher hit the media, and one of their children posted about it on Facebook. They immediately took the post down. Now, if the police did canvass the neighborhood, as they said they did, how did this get missed? Or was it just a case of, well, I just don't want to get involved? Either way, another potentially good piece of evidence thrown into the recycling bin. Sweet. Both John and Andrea Woods were accomplished scientists who would move to East Falmouth, Massachusetts after selling their home. But at one point, Andrea was asked for a DNA sample based on the envelope's residue. Again, there was no match. Their 21-year-old son was also interviewed but dismissed as a suspect. This one is a head-scratcher. While conducting a stakeout at 657 Boulevard one night, Detective Chambliss and his partner watched a car stop in front of the house for a period of time. Chambliss ran the plates, and they were traced back to a young woman in a nearby town who had a boyfriend that lived on the same block as the Broadduses. When interviewed, she claimed her boyfriend was into some really dark video games that included one where he played online under the alias The Watcher. At that point, she was also considered a suspect because of the female DNA found on one of the envelopes. The boyfriend was contacted and agreed on 2 separate occasions to come in to be questioned, but on neither occasion bothered to show up. Because there wasn't enough evidence to order or compel him to appear, any case against him was dropped and he was never spoken to. Now on TV, where the police think they have probable cause and enough to go in and kick down the door of somebody's house and ask them a few questions, yeah, don't believe anything you see. It didn't take long for the neighbors to turn themselves into amateur detectives, and when a group would gather on the street to compare notes, they floated the idea that it was Derek and Maria themselves who invented the Watcher. Their theory was based on the premise that the couple was suffering from buyer's remorse and had gotten in over their heads with the $1.4 million price tag. They then concocted a scheme to get out of the sale by creating a villain bent on harming them and their children. Or perhaps because Derek was in the insurance business, he was plotting some type of fraud scheme to recover their money. Another theory was they were looking to cash in on a movie deal, Amity House style. It should be noted that indeed they were approached on multiple occasions for rights to their story, but turned all of them down. The Lifetime Network did eventually air a movie called The Watcher, ignoring a cease and desist letter from the Broadduses. In it, the couple was biracial and the letters were signed The Raven. No word if the descendants of Edgar Allan Poe were in on that cease and desist order. Other points of interest was how the Broadduses could make such a dramatic jump from a $315,000 home to a $770,000 home to a $1.4 million home over a 10-year span while refinancing their mortgages. Some residents even wrote op-eds to the local paper warning that a scam was underway to defraud the Woods out of millions of dollars with others asking why it took so long to disclose the existence of the letters, with no knowledge the police had asked them not to do so. It's been said some of the local cops were also suspicious of the Broadduses' motives. Many locals told an interviewer from The Cut that they were more concerned about appearances than anything else, and how news of a madman on the loose would affect property values and aesthetics, or even whether the Broadduses would bother to mow their lawn, because priorities, you know. Now, the Broadduses would remain in Westfield for at least 2 more years after that first letter was sent, mainly at Maria's assistance, as this was her hometown, and she was not about to let her family get run out of there. So they dealt with the sideways glances, the whispers, and worse, their kids being teased at school because of where they lived and what was going on there. So they borrowed money from family, bought a new house, and as far as we know, they still reside in Westfield. Now, as for the Watcher, this wasn't some supernatural entity plotting against a family with children. It was something even more malevolent than that. It was a living, breathing individual with evil intent who was willing to strike fear and terror into the hearts of a family merely just to control them.